I came back with 2 bags, no job, no real plan, and a pit in my stomach that hadn't left since the day I walked out of that apartment in Austin. The sky over town was heavy. Not dramatic or stormy, just low and dull, like it was leaning into. Close, and the wind carried that dry, end-of-summer smell that always made me feel like something had run out. The Welcome to Bayfield sign near the turnoff had the same crack through the middle I remembered from high school, and the grocery store still had the same sun-faded posters for shrimp boils and church raffles taped to the windows. Almost nothing had changed. Except me, Mom's old trailer, the one that used to smell like fried onions and cheap lavender spray, had been sold while I was gone and she'd moved into a boxy little house by the bay with Tom. I hadn't been in. Touch enough to know when exactly it happened. Probably didn't ask the right questions. When I got to the house, Tom answered the door like he'd been expecting a package. Not a person, no hello, no questions, just a quiet once-over and then a step back to let me in. The place was clean and small, with beige walls and those narrow windows that make everything look like it's always 5 in the evening. Tom handed me a key to the back room and told me flatly that the sheets were clean and the water heater was touchy. We didn't talk much after that. We never really did, even when I was a kid. Tom had always been the kind of man who could go an entire Sunday without saying more than 5 words, and back then I found something comforting in that. His silence used to feel like safety. These days, it felt more like a wall I'd never. How the tools to climb out the room itself was simple: a twin bed with a quilt that looked handmade, a 3-drawer dresser, and a dusty window overlooking a patch of grass trying real hard to be a yard. I dropped my bags and sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the house settle around me, the soft groans of wood and distant hum of the fridge. The place felt borrowed. That night, the rain started around midnight. Not loud or dramatic, just a steady tapping on the roof that worked its way into my chest like it belonged there. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the room lit only by the soft flicker of a street lamp outside the window. Somewhere down the hall, I heard Tom's footsteps, slow and deliberate, like he was checking something or maybe just moving around too. Stay sane, and just like that, I was 9 years old again, lying in another small room in another house, listening to the same kind of footsteps and trying to guess what Tom was thinking. Back then, he'd only just come into our lives. Mom said he was helping her with things, though I don't think I ever figured out what exactly that meant. He wasn't loud or mean or even especially warm, but he had this way of being present without crowding the air, which, when you're a kid with a mom who works doubles and forgets birthdays, can feel like the closest thing to safety you get. But now, lying there in that unfamiliar bed, listening to the same quiet movements, the silence didn't comfort me. It felt like a fuse, burning towards something I couldn't name. I didn't know if he knew what happened in Austin or why I was really back. Honestly, I didn't even know what story I'd tell if he asked. The next morning, I found him in the kitchen, already dressed, drinking coffee out of a chipped mug that looked like it had survived a dozen drop tool arguments in some garage. He glanced up when I walked in, but didn't say anything right away. Just went back to whatever article he was pretending to read in the local paper. You know any place that's hiring? I asked after a minute. Without looking up, he said, motel off the highway usually needs night help. You can try there. And that was that. No follow-up, no curiosity, just a simple exchange of information. Like I was someone asking for directions, not someone sleeping under his roof. Mom wasn't home. A note was taped to the fridge in her usual bubbly handwriting that hadn't changed. Since I was a teenager, gone to see Linda in Tulsa. Be back Sunday. Don't forget to water the fern. Glad you're home. Something about that word home felt like it was written for someone else. That afternoon I walked into town, not because I wanted to, but because sitting in that house any longer made me feel like I was shrinking. A couple of familiar faces passed me on the sidewalk, people I'd gone to school with, or whose kids I used to babysit. They didn't say anything. Just gave that quick glance people do when they're trying to decide. If small talk is worth the effort, it never is, not in towns like this. People remember everything but pretend they don't, unless they need something from you. The motel wasn't much to look at, just a squat. L-shaped building with flaking white paint and a neon vacancy. Sign that buzzed like it was dying. The woman behind the counter didn't smile when I walked in. She barely looked up from her tablet. You do nights? She asked. I can. You clean? If that's part of the deal, yeah. She gave me a once-over like she was deciding whether or not to bother giving me a second chance if I messed up. Room 12's a mess. Be here at midnight.
Don't.
Be late. I didn't ask about pay. I just said okay and walked back toward the house, feet aching, socks soaked through my shoes from a puddle I didn't see in time. When I passed the garage, Tom was working on what looked like an old outboard.
Motor.
He didn't look up, and I didn't slow down. Later that night, as I pulled on an old sweatshirt and tried to psych myself up for cleaning motel rooms in the dark, Tom spoke for the first time since that morning. He didn't look at me, just, stared out the window and said, "Keys are on the table if you need the truck."
It wasn't much.
But in that house, even a sentence like that felt like a hand reaching out across some kind of quiet divide neither of us knew how to cross. The motel at night had a strange kind of stillness that made time feel slower than it should be, as if the hours between midnight and dawn didn't quite follow the same rules as the rest of the day. By the time I walked through the front doors for my first shift, the parking lot was already mostly empty, save for a long-haul truck idling under one of the busted street lamps and a dusty sedan with out-of-state plates. Its rear-view mirror weighed down by a plastic air freshener shaped like a pineapple. The woman at the front desk, her name was Maggie, though I didn't learn that until my third shift, barely looked up when I arrived. Just pointed to the clipboard on the counter and said, without much interest, "Room 12, linens in the closet. Don't use the bleach unless you want the curtains to melt." There was no training, no welcome tour, no handbook on how to handle the guy in room 7, who locked himself out every other night in his boxer shorts and never once looked embarrassed about it. You learned fast, or you didn't last, and since I didn't have the luxury of quitting anything, I started learning. The nights passed in a haze of static from the portable radio behind the desk, the occasional phone call from someone asking about weekly rates, and the weirdly soothing routine of wiping down surfaces and replacing towels that were never really clean, no matter how many times they'd been washed. Most of the guests didn't speak unless they needed something, and even then, they avoided eye contact like they were doing something they shouldn't be and didn't want anyone to witness it. In a place like that, anonymity was a currency. Few nights in, I met Sean. He worked 2 doors down at a 24-hour auto repair place that smelled like diesel and burnt coffee. He came into the motel lobby around 3 a.m. looking for a vending machine that wasn't empty, and when I told him it hadn't been restocked in a week, he laughed, said something about this town being allergic to functioning schedules, and offered me half of his sandwich instead. We ate in the break room, which was really just a folding table shoved between 2 broken vending machines and a microwave that sparked when you used anything with foil. Sean had one of those faces that made you think he used to smile more than he does now, but still had just enough of that old habit left to make you feel like he wasn't faking it. He talked with his hands a lot, told stories that wandered, and circled back in ways that reminded me of my uncle after 2 beers, and he didn't ask too many questions about me, which is probably why I liked him right away. After that, we started meeting at the Red Lantern on our nights off, a bar that hadn't changed since the 90s and still had the same cracked leather booths and wall-mounted jukebox that played the same 8 country songs on repeat. Nobody cared who you were or why you were there, as long as you tipped the bartender and didn't pick fights. It became our spot not because we said it was, but because neither of us ever suggested going anywhere else one night, about a week, into this quiet pattern we'd fallen into. I walked into the bar a little after midnight, still smelling faintly of motel disinfectant, and saw Tom sitting alone in the corner. He was hunched over a coffee, not a beer, and he didn't look up when I passed, didn't acknowledge me at all. It was like he'd come there to be invisible, which would have worked, if not for the fact that I noticed him the second I walked. And something about seeing him in that space, a place that had always felt separate from the rest of my life, unsettled me more than I expected. I didn't know if he'd followed me or if this was just one of those small-town coincidences, where lines crossed without meaning to.
I didn't stay long after that.
Made some excuse about needing to rest before my shift, though I wasn't even scheduled that night. I walked home through the quiet, the sound of my boots on the pavement louder than anything else around me, and by the time I got back, Tom was already on the porch.
He didn't say anything.
Just sat there with a cigarette burning low between his fingers, the smoke curling up in slow spirals that disappeared before I could trace them. I stood at the bottom of the steps for a second, thinking maybe I'd say something, ask why he was at the bar, or why he hadn't said anything, but In the end, I just nodded once, and he nodded back like we were both pretending we hadn't seen each other earlier. Inside, the house felt colder than usual, even with the windows shut and the thermostat glowing steadily at 68. Something in the air had shifted. Not in a dramatic way, but the way pressure changes before a storm, not loud or immediate, but enough to make your skin feel too tight. The next morning, neither of us mentioned the bar. He fixed himself coffee like always, didn't ask where I'd been, didn't look like he was waiting for me to bring it up, and I didn't offer anything. But it hung there anyway, invisible but unmistakable. Like the smell of smoke hours after the fire's out. It was Sean's idea to get out of town for a bit, and I didn't argue, mostly because I didn't have anything better to do and something in me needed air that didn't taste like bleach and motel carpet. He picked me up after my shift, his truck rattling down the side road like it might fall apart at every bump, and we drove past the edges of Bayfield where the trees grew taller and the houses thinned out into long stretches of nothing but fields. In Waterdot, he took us to a place he used to go fishing with his dad, a quiet little dock behind an old boathouse that probably hadn't seen a real boat in years. The boards beneath our feet creaked with every step, and the water below was still, except for the occasional ripple from a fish too small to bother catching. There were empty beer cans scattered around, and someone had carved initials into one. Of the wooden posts, nothing unusual, just the leftovers of people trying to leave a mark in a place that would forget them anyway. We sat on the edge of the dock, legs dangling over the water, and I watched Sean skip rocks like he was trying to prove something, maybe to himself. After a while, he started talking, not small talk, not stories about old jobs or bad customers, but real stuff. He told me about a contract offer he'd gotten, something out of state, good pay, full benefits, the kind of thing people around here talk about like it's winning the lottery. He said it like he wasn't sure how I'd react, like he was testing the waters before stepping in. I nodded, said something like, "That's great," because it should be, but the words felt flat even as I said them. I didn't ask when he was leaving. I didn't ask if he was coming back. I didn't ask anything that would make it real. The sun was starting to dip low by then, that kind of orange light that makes everything look like a photograph from a better time. I turned toward him, and before I could even think through what I was doing, he leaned in, slow, almost cautious, and I didn't move. The kiss wasn't rushed or desperate. It was the kind that comes from two people quietly asking if maybe, just for a second, they could forget everything else. But the second it ended, something in my chest twisted hard like a pulled muscle. You didn't know it was sore until you moved the wrong way. I looked away, suddenly aware of how quiet it had gotten, how far we were from anything, how my hands were clenched in my lap, like just been caught doing something I wasn't supposed to. We didn't say much on the drive back. He turned the radio on halfway through the trip, and neither of us changed the station, even when it crackled through static. When we reached my place, he parked and looked at me like he wanted to say something else, but whatever it was got swallowed up by the weight of everything unspoken. I got out, thanked him, and walked up the steps without turning around. Tom was on the porch again, this time standing instead of sitting, like he'd been pacing and stopped just as I came into view. He didn't speak when I approached, didn't ask where I'd been or who I'd been with, but his eyes lingered a little too long, and there was something in the way he held his jaw tight, unreadable, that made me feel like I'd been found out, even if there was nothing to find. I gave a quiet hey, tried to slide past him toward the door, but he didn't move, just looked out toward the yard like he was watching for something that hadn't arrived yet. Eventually, he stepped aside, and I went in without looking back, my stomach heavy with that same slow blooming guilt that starts as discomfort and ends up living somewhere permanent. In my room, I sat on the bed and stared at the wall, trying to tell myself it was just a kiss, just a moment, that it didn't mean anything I wasn't ready for, but that was the lie. The truth was, it meant something not about Sean, but about me, about what I'd been trying to avoid, and the things I still hadn't made peace with. And I had the sinking feeling that whatever came next wasn't going to let me pretend. Otherwise, Mom got back that Sunday afternoon, dragging her suitcase through the front door like she just returned from a war zone instead of a weekend. With her sister in Tulsa, her energy filled the house immediately. All jangling bracelets and half-unpacked stories about bad hotel coffee and Linda's new boyfriend, who apparently wore socks with sandals and thought astrology was a government trick. I smiled in the right places and nodded when she needed agreement, but my head wasn't really in it, and she noticed. She always noticed Dot by the time dinner rolled around. The house had that kind of tension you can't quite put your finger on, until someone drops a fork and everyone flinches. She'd cook something she didn't do much anymore unless she was trying to make a point or pretend everything was okay. There were baked chicken thighs, over-steamed green beans, and a casserole. That smelled better than it looked. The three of us sat around the table, and the silence between bites was louder than the old ceiling fan spinning above us. Tom barely said anything, which wasn't unusual, but that night his silence had a sharper edge to it, like he was choosing his words carefully by choosing none at all. He kept his eyes on his plate, his hands steady, and when he finally did speak, it was just to ask Mom to pass the pepper. She kept glancing between us like she was trying to solve a puzzle no one gave her the pieces for. I picked at the food, not hungry but pretending to be, which I was starting to realize had become a habit lately pretending. I answered a few of her questions with half smiles and vague replies, hoping she'd eventually let it go. But she didn't. After the table was cleared, Tom disappeared into the garage under the excuse of checking the breaker, though I didn't hear any tools, just the familiar sound of the door shutting behind him and staying shut.
Mom cornered
me in the kitchen while I rinsed plates, leaning against the counter with a glass of wine in one hand, and that look in her eye that meant I wasn't getting out of the room without giving her something. "Okay," she said, in the same tone she used to use when I come home late, smelling like someone else's cologne. "What's going on?" I shrugged, keeping my eyes on the soapy water. "Nothing. I'm just tired." "You've been just tired for 3 years," she said, not angry, just blunt, which somehow landed harder. "But your eyes look different. You're carrying something." I've seen that look before. I didn't say anything right away. I just kept rinsing the same plate over and over until the water turned cold. She waited because she knew silence better than most people, and she wasn't afraid to use it. Eventually I said, "It's nothing big, just some stuff I'm trying to work through." She didn't buy it. She never did. "Is it about Austin or someone here?"
She paused. "Where is it, Tom?" I froze.
Not because she'd hit the mark exactly, but because she'd said his name in a way that carried too much weight, like she was daring me to flinch. I didn't flinch. But I did lie. "No, it's nothing like that." She studied me for another long second, then nodded, like she'd heard what she needed even if it wasn't what she wanted. "When I was your age, I got real good at pretending," she said. "Until one day, I couldn't keep the story straight anymore. That's usually when the real trouble starts, when the lies start overlapping. I wanted to tell her that I wasn't pretending, that I was just floating, trying to keep my head above water without dragging anyone else under with me. But the words felt too messy, too complicated for that tiny kitchen with its peeling wallpaper and ticking clock. So I just nodded and said I was fine. She didn't push again. But as she left the room, she looked back and said, "You should talk to someone before this thing gets too big to carry." And the thing is, I didn't even know which thing she meant. The kiss? The silence? The look in Tom's eyes that night on the porch? Or maybe all of it. Maybe none of it. I wasn't sure anymore where it started or what I was supposed to do with any of it. By the time I went to bed, the house was still. I could hear the distant hum of the garage light, which meant Tom hadn't come inside yet. Mom's door was closed, and I lay there staring at the ceiling, wondering how long you can live with a secret before it stops feeling like one and just becomes part of who you are. It was Tom who asked if I wanted to go with him into town, casually, like we hadn't spent the last few weeks orbiting each other in the same narrow house without ever really crossing paths. He needed groceries, said he could use help lifting the big bags of soil Mom wanted for her raised beds. I agreed without thinking too hard about it. Part of me just wanted to get out of the house before the walls started pressing in again. And the other part, quieter but harder to ignore, wondered what it meant that he asked at all. The drive was quiet. The kind of quiet that didn't need filling with small talk, but still made me aware of every mile that passed without a word. The truck smelled like motor oil and sawdust, and I watched the trees slide by through the passenger window, trying to ignore the subtle tension that had settled between us. Like dust on furniture no one's touched in a while. We didn't go to the store first. Instead, Tom turned off the main road and headed toward the coast, down one of those narrow dirt lanes that eventually led to the bluffs overlooking the bay. I knew where we were going before we got there. The benches on the overlook were worn down from years of cell air and teenagers carving initials into them. I hadn't been out there since high school. He parked without saying anything, killed the engine, and stepped out. I followed, unsure whether this was supposed to be a conversation or something else. We sat down next to each other on the bench. The breeze off the water was sharp, but not unpleasant, and the waves broke against the rocks below with a dull rhythm. That made the silence feel almost deliberate. I've been thinking a lot lately, he said after a few minutes, still watching the water. Feels like something's coming undone. His voice wasn't heavy or emotional, it was just there. Like he was stating a fact he'd finally decided to say out loud. I didn't know what to do with that. My instinct was to ask what exactly he meant, but I already knew. Or maybe I didn't. Not really, but I felt the weight of it anyway. That quiet unraveling had been in the air for weeks, maybe longer. You can only avoid looking directly at something for so long before it starts taking shape in your peripheral vision. I don't know when it started, he added. Feels like it snuck up piece by piece. There was a long pause where neither of us said anything, and I think that was the moment I could have asked the question that had been clawing at the edge of my mind for days. What are we really talking about here? But I didn't, because asking meant stepping into something I couldn't walk back from, and I wasn't sure I was ready to hear the answer. Instead, I said, I felt it too, which was the truth, even if it wasn't the whole truth. I couldn't put it into words, how the air in the house had changed. How even the sound of him setting down a coffee mug felt loaded now. How nothing had technically happened, but everything still felt different. It wasn't about the kiss with Sean, not directly, but maybe it cracked something that was already fragile. Tom didn't reply. He just nodded slightly, and we sat there for a while longer, both watching the bay like we expected it to reveal something. When we finally got back to the house, the sun was low and the wind had picked up. Mom's car was in the driveway and the front door was cracked open, letting out the faint sound of some old country record she only played when she was trying to get in a better mood. We carried the groceries in without saying anything. She looked up from the sink, her eyes bouncing between the two of us. And I could tell just from the way she paused mid-rinse and reached to turn down the music that she felt it too. Not the details, not the facts, but the shift. The quiet rearrangement happening beneath the surface of things. Dinner that night was quieter than usual, which was saying something. I excused myself early, blaming a headache, and as I passed Mom's chair, I felt her watching me again, this time not with suspicion, but with something closer to worry. Or maybe it was recognition back in my room. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, trying to name the thing that had taken root between all of us, the thing none of us had the language to address. It wasn't an affair. It wasn't betrayal in the obvious sense. It was something more subtle, more insidious. It was what happens when people stop saying the things that matter and start letting the silence fill in the blanks. And now, no one was quite sure what the silence had decided for us. Sean didn't say goodbye. Showed up for my shift like always half awake, still shaking off the weight of the day before, and found a folded piece of paper on the front desk, wedged under the bell with my name scribbled across it in his rushed, looping handwriting. There was no envelope, just the note and a stale peppermint he must have found in the pocket of his work jacket. You're not a problem. You just haven't figured out what you want. Maybe that's worse. Take care of yourself. That was it. No signature, no explanation, not even a date. Scribbled in the corner like people sometimes do when they want to remind you the moment was real. I read it twice, then slid it into my jacket without folding it back up. It wasn't that I didn't see it coming. I'd known, even before the kiss, that he was halfway out the door, but something about being left like that, without even a face to pin it on, knocked the wind out of me more than I expected. I worked my shift anyway, cleaned the rooms, answered the phones, replaced cheap bars of soap that always smelled like plastic lemons. Everything felt just slightly off, like I was underwater, hearing things muffled and distorted, going through the motions without feeling any of it land. When the sun started to rise, I didn't go home. I didn't want to walk into that house. Again, not with the kitchen light already on and Tom maybe sitting in his chair with the paper open, and that silence between us stretched thin again. Instead, I took one of the empty rooms the cleaning staff hadn't gotten to yet and let myself in, not caring if someone noticed. It wasn't like anyone checked the log that closely. The room was cold, The bed stiff, the carpet damp in the corner from some slow leak under the AC. But I lay down anyway, not to sleep, just to be somewhere else. Somewhere quiet, even if that. Quiet came with water stains and flickering lights. I kept thinking about the kiss, not because it meant something deep or romantic, but because it had pulled something to the surface I'd been trying to ignore. Sean had given me a moment of connection, and I grabbed it like a life raft, not realizing it was just a piece of driftwood. That kiss didn't break anything. It only lit up everything that was already cracked out at home. Things were quieter than ever. Mom started leaving for work earlier, sometimes not coming back until after dark. She said it was overtime, but I think we both knew she just didn't want to be there, didn't want to sit at the table with the weight of everything. No one was saying. Tom, for his part, started timing his movements to avoid mine. He stopped coming into the kitchen in the mornings, fixed things in the garage for longer than necessary, and once, when I was in the living room folding laundry, he walked in, saw me, and backed out without a word. That silence didn't feel like a punishment. It felt like a choice. Like he'd made peace with keeping his distance, and all I could do was mirror it back. I tried to text Mom a couple times just to say hi or ask if she needed anything. She didn't respond. Not coldly, just not at all. And it wasn't the first time. I'd done this before, gone quiet for long stretches, and she'd always reached out eventually. But this time, the silence held out at the motel. Things stayed the same night shifts, cleaning supplies that never quite worked, customers who tipped and left over pizza crust or didn't tip at all. I started drifting. Not in any dramatic, falling apart kind of way, just slowly, like I was becoming see-through. Like the version of me who had plans and ideas and reasons was getting quieter, and the version of me who just got through each day was the one taking over. I thought about leaving again, about packing my things and driving until the gas ran out, maybe heading west this time instead of south. But the truth was, I didn't even have enough money to fill the tank, let alone start over. Austin had already burned through my savings, and this place, for all its ghosts and quiet judgment, was the only one still willing to pretend I hadn't disappeared. Sometimes I catch myself staring out the motel window in the early morning, watching the fog settle over the highway like a secret no one was ready to tell. And I think about how easy it is to confuse motion with meaning, how easy it is to keep busy just so you don't have to sit still and feel what's underneath. That kiss didn't change my life, but it did strip away whatever little illusion I'd been clinging to about what I was doing here, about who I was trying to be. And in the absence of Sean, in the absence of answers, in the absence of anyone reaching across that widening gap between me and everything, I used to be sure I was left with just the echo of it. That feeling of something almost happening, almost mattering, and that feeling didn't go away. It just settled in, like dust in an empty room, waiting for someone to decide whether to clean it up or just learn to live with it. Sleep had become optional. I'd lie in bed for hours, eyes open in the dark, listening to the sounds the house-made pipes settling, branches tapping the window, the occasional low creak of someone moving down the hall. Tom's footsteps had a particular rhythm to them, heavy, unhurried, like someone walking through a place that didn't quite belong to them, even after all these years. Some nights I heard him. Most nights I didn't. I wasn't sure which was worse that night. I finally gave up around 2 a.m. and pulled on a hoodie, not even sure where I was going when I walked out the front door. The air was colder than I expected, sharp enough to sting, and I kept my hands shoved deep in my pockets as I followed the path past the house and down toward the docks. I didn't even think about where I was heading until I was already there, standing on the same warped boards where Sean and I had kissed. The bay flat and black beneath me like spilled ink. Tom was already there. He stood at the far end of the dock, facing the water, arms crossed like he'd been standing that way for a while. He didn't turn around when he heard my footsteps. Just said, without looking back, "Can't sleep?" I shook my head, then realized he couldn't see that. "No," I said quietly. "Not really." I moved next to him, keeping a couple feet between us, both of us looking out at the same nothing. The dock groaned under our weight. A gull called out somewhere in the dark, its sound sharp and lonely. We stood like that for a long time, not speaking, just listening to the water lap gently at the posts beneath us. And then, without any shift in tone or warning, I asked, "Do you regret it?" The words surprised even me. Tom didn't move, didn't blink, just stared ahead like the question had come from somewhere else. After a long pause, he exhaled through his nose and said, "I'm not sure what I believe anymore. That's the problem." It wasn't the answer I expected. It wasn't even an answer, really, but something about it landed harder than if he'd just said yes or no. He wasn't avoiding the question. He was naming the fact that it didn't have a clear answer. I looked at him, then not directly, just enough to catch the side of his face in the moonlight.
He looked tired.
Older than I remembered, like the years had finally started to show in the lines around his mouth and the gray that had crept into his hair when no one was paying attention. "There is a difference," he said quietly, "between keeping quiet, to protect something, and keeping quiet because you're afraid of what happens when the words come out." I think I got those confused. I didn't know what to say to that, and honestly, I didn't think he expected a response. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't even about us, not really. It was just a man talking into the cold, trying to make sense of the silence he'd helped build dots, so I just said the truth, because it felt like the only thing left. "I don't know what I'm doing." "I know," he said. "Neither do I." It wasn't much, but it was the closest thing to real we'd said to each other in weeks. There was no apology in it, no explanation, no demands. Just two people, standing on splintered wood, staring at water they couldn't see the bottom of, and admitting without shame that they were lost. Eventually, he turned and started walking back, his footsteps soft but sure. I stayed behind, letting the cold soak in a little deeper, letting the moment settle. He hadn't told me what I wanted to hear, but he had told me what was true. And maybe that was the only thing that mattered anymore. Mom left on a Wednesday.no. Warning, no big announcement, just a scribbled note on the kitchen counter saying she was going to stay with her sister for a while and that I could water the plants if I felt like keeping them alive this time. She didn't leave a return date. She didn't call. I don't think it was about me, not entirely. Maybe she just had enough of the house and the way everything inside it had turned into. Something you had to tiptoe around. .tom was gone too. Days later, .no note, no message. Just vanished. His tools were still in the garage. Half the lights in the house were still on timers. And the coffee cup he always used was still drying on the rack like he'd be back in an hour. But he didn't come back. The truck was gone and so was he. I waited a few days. Part of me thought he might walk through the door like nothing had happened, sit down at the table with that usual blank expression and ask if I'd checked the oil in the generator. But eventually I stopped waiting. The quiet settled into the walls like mold, slow and suffocating. After that, I checked into a room at the motel. Not because I had anywhere else to go, but because the idea of waking up in that house alone, surrounded by half-used shampoo bottles and grocery lists with no names on them, made me feel like I was slowly being erased. The motel room wasn't much, just a sagging bed, a broken remote, and a window that faced the road, but it was neutral. Empty in a way that didn't carry weight. I could exist there without having to answer to anything. Work was still there. The same broken vending machines, the same front desk chair with one leg shorter than the others. People still came and went, and I started to understand that the job wasn't about doing anything well. It was about showing up, staying invisible, and knowing when to pretend you hadn't seen something. I texted Mom again, once, just a short message. "You okay? Need anything?" She didn't answer. Around town, people recognized me, sure. This wasn't a place where you could hide. But recognition isn't the same as connection. Most of them looked away when we made eye contact, not out of cruelty, just out of habit. People in Bayfield didn't ask questions they didn't want to know the answers to. And I had become a question no one wanted to touch. I walked a lot after shifts. Down back roads, past old stores with for lease signs sun-bleached into the windows. Across parking lots where no one parked anymore. I passed teenagers sneaking beers behind the gas station or an older couple smoking outside their trailer. Like it was the only place they could talk without being overheard. No one paid me any mind. Sometimes I thought about Sean, not because I missed him, he had come and gone like weather, but because of what his leaving had made clear. That kiss hadn't changed anything. It hadn't fixed me. It hadn't pulled me out of the fog. It just held a mirror up to everything I'd been trying to ignore. I wasn't broken because of him. I was broken long before. The house stood empty. But I'd still go back sometimes just to walk through it. Not to clean or pack or do anything useful. Just to feel it. I'd move through the room slowly, my footsteps echoing louder than they should have. pausing in doorways like something might stop me, but nothing ever did. There was no grand discovery. No final answer waiting in a drawer. Just dust and old furniture and a feeling like everyone who had ever lived there had simply faded out. Some people leave in loud, obvious ways. Others just stopped showing up. I thought a lot about what it meant to stay. Whether I was still here out of stubbornness, or fear, or just because it was easier than starting over. I wasn't sure. Maybe I'd figure it out. Maybe I wouldn't. I just knew I hadn't gone. And there was something in that. Not pride. Exactly. Just presence. A decision that didn't feel like one at the time, but counted all the same. I'm not the main story here, not in the way people like to believe when they imagine someone's life turning a corner. I didn't burn the house down or chase anyone to an airport or make a speech in the rain. I stayed. I went to work. I stopped asking the kinds of questions that didn't have real answers. That kiss, it wasn't the beginning. It was the flare. That showed how cracked the walls already were. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. You either run or you sit inside it and figure out how to live with the echoes. I'm still here. Not the way I used to be. But I'm here, and sometimes.
That's enough.